Are you receiving unwanted sales calls and texts? If you would like to reduce the number of solicitation calls you receive, register for the Wisconsin Do Not Call Registry. Registration should stop legitimate telemarketing calls and texts from legitimate businesses. This can also reduce your risk of being a victim of fraud because you know all unsolicited calls are likely scammers. It's free and easy to register. You can register online at nocall.wisconsin.gov or by calling 888-382-1222 from the phone you want to register. You can sign up cell phones, landlines, and VoIP numbers. Once you register, your number will show up on the list by the next day, but telemarketers covered by the Do Not Call Registry have up to 31 days from the date you register to stop calling you. A telephone number stays on the Do Not Call Registry until the registration is canceled or service for the number is discontinued. It's important to note that some businesses or organizations are permitted by Wisconsin law to call and text numbers on the registry, so you may still receive calls and texts from businesses when you are a current client, tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, and calls such as polls, surveys, and political messages. While legitimate telemarketing companies typically follow the rules, scammers do not. Criminals often use the phone as a tool to scam unsuspecting consumers, so if your number is on the Do Not Call Registry and you receive unsolicited calls, it's safe to assume that it's probably a scam. Which leads us to robocalls. Robocalls are calls made by auto dialers that send out thousands of phone calls to numerous phone numbers. If you answer the phone and hear a recorded message instead of a live person, it's a robocall. You've probably gotten robocalls about candidates running for office or charities asking for donations. These robocalls are allowed, but if the recording is a sales message and you haven't given your permission to get calls from the company on the other end, the call is illegal. If you receive a robocall like that, hang up the phone. Pressing a number to speak to a live operator or to get your number off their list lets them know they've reached a live number. This will probably lead to more robocalls. The Bureau of Consumer Protection is committed to ensuring that Wisconsin's Do Not Call law is enforced. If you are on the Do Not Call Registry and you get a solicitation from a telemarketer 31 days after you registered your number, or if you want to report robocall violations, file a complaint at datcp.wi.gov and click on File a Complaint under Quick Links or call 1-800-422-7128. Find additional resources for consumers on the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection website, where you can find detailed fact sheets on a wide variety of topics. Enroll in Consumer Protection 101 by subscribing to our YouTube channel or following us on social media. More resources are available on the Consumer Protection 101 webpage at www.datcp.wi.gov.